Lynn Bowman, and this is Elektra Diakolambrianou from the Transformative Play Initiative. And today we're going to talk about groups, processes, dynamics, facilitation, and creativity. And the reason we're talking about groups is because role-playing, although it can be single player, is by nature a group process and is often played with more than one person. And because of that, it can be conducive to group work and is also really important to consider in terms of community processes. So we're going to be talking about some of the theories around that today. Next slide, please.
Okay, so let's start by visiting a very well-known theory when it comes to group development and the stages that it takes. It is the theory of Bruce Tuckman. You may have heard it also because the stages, according to this theory, rhyme together: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Let's see the stages one by one. So first of all, we start in the pre-group phase, where the direction and framework of the group should be considered. And then we're moving to the first stage, forming, which we can also call the orientation phase. During this stage, norms are discussed, confidentiality, attendance, any rules that have to do with communication and participation in the group, and also the time frame of the group and when and how it will be terminated. The second stage, storming, can also be called the transition phase, is where we start having anxiety, ambiguity, and conflict in the group. Group members in this phase test and act out behaviors in order to define themselves within the group and also to define the group norms. In this stage, an interpersonal climate is created or should be created, in which members should feel safe to disagree with each other if needed. The third stage, norming, is also called the cohesiveness phase. This is when members start developing group-specific standards, and also where therapeutic alliance starts existing if we're talking about a therapeutic group, but also if we're talking about any group that starts taking some therapeutic characteristics. The fourth stage, performing, is the working phase. It is during this stage where growth and productivity happens, so individual and team, and where effectiveness starts occurring in the group. Members can experiment with new ideas and behaviors, and gradually egalitarianism develops. So, stage 5, adjourning, is the termination phase. It's when we are slowly arriving to the closure for the group as a whole, or that some individuals are going to leave the group. It is when it is important to discuss and review the actual outcomes and achievements of the group, to explore feelings of what worked and what didn't throughout the process, and also to talk about any feelings of loss that members may experience. Introducing any new concerns or any new initiatives, it's not appropriate at this stage of the group. Back to Sarah.
So it's worth noting that Tuckman stages have been used by several scholars. I mention it in my social conflict and role-playing communities article, which we'll be talking about a little bit more later. But I'm really citing Stephen Balzac there, who has done a lot of theoretical work on this topic. Diana J. Leonard has also expanded on that work to talk about the life cycle of a LARP group and LARP group dynamics, and has also tested that model later. And then Joe Lasley has also talked about Tuckman a bit in his dissertation, which deals a lot with leadership and the role of leadership in group dynamics.
Now, moving from the stages of the group, we can talk a little bit about group roles, so the various roles that group members can take within the group. Here I will mention a little bit the work of Sophie Courau, who is an author of books mainly on adult education, but she has also researched a lot the use of play and role-playing in education. The variety of roles that can be identified in groups and in group members is very vast, and fully mapping them is quite difficult. But some examples that Sophie Courau came up with, especially from educational groups, are the following: the silent member, the know-it-all, the provocateur, the harmonizer, the group savior, the debater, the meticulous member, the tension releaser, the interpreter, and many more. And I think that many, if not all, these roles can also be observed in role-playing group settings. Moving on, we will talk a little bit also about Mark Aveline's theory on principles of leadership in groups. According to Aveline, there are 5 aims of group facilitators that may also interest us within our context. So the first one is containment of anxiety. So the group facilitator should explore the anxiety sources that exist within the group and its members, and create a group structure that somehow soothes this anxiety. The second one is the establishment of a therapeutic climate. And this doesn't only have to do with therapeutic groups, psychotherapeutic groups, but with any groups in which we would like to see transformation take place. And this includes norms of support, acceptance, and autonomy. The third one is goal setting. In this context, the goals should be appropriate and most of all achievable within the time frame of the group. The fourth one is setting the group pace. Again, the pace should be appropriate and not a pace that potentially leads members into forced or harmful self-exposure. And the last one is closure. So according to Aveline, closure, and specifically ensuring a safe transition into closure, is one of the aims and responsibilities of the group facilitator. Let's now visit another theory on groups, and specifically one that comes from the person-centered approach in psychotherapy. In this context, in humanistic orientations of psychotherapy, we usually refer to psychotherapeutic groups as encounter groups. So according to Peter Schmidt, an encounter group can be defined as a form of group psychotherapy that is based on trust in the self-developing process, mutual acknowledging, and the meeting of group members as persons. Encounter groups is a term that has been coined by Carl Rogers, who in the beginning used encounter groups only in psychotherapeutic settings, but later opened up the theory for a widespread use of the encounter group in many other settings that focus on helping professions or helping relationships. In this context, we don't refer to the leader of the group as the group leader, but as the group facilitator. Now, some characteristics of encounter groups that can be applied outside the psychotherapeutic setting and therefore can be interesting to us in the role-playing context as well are the following. First of all, the conditions of therapeutic change that you may remember from previous material as well have to be modeled and provided by the group facilitator. So when we are talking about conditions, here we're talking about authenticity, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. These conditions will create a climate of trust within the group and also facilitate a growth process for each member individually, but also for the group as a whole. Another element is that the process of personal and group development will gradually enable the individual and group potential to arise, and thus will foster intra and intergroup relationship. These relationships, so any relationship within the group, person to person, is seen in this context as a specific therapeutic agent. The group's process, however, cannot be specifically predicted. And not only that, but having special expectations for the process can be actually a hindrance for its development. It is important that both the facilitator, but also the group members focus on the here and now, in meaning here that focus in the present, but also in their presence within the group, the existential attitude of presence. The group is thus seen as a very important interface of individual and society. And Carl Rogers thinks that in this context, groups have an anticipatory function for societal and political change, and also a socio-therapeutic impact. So there are many process patterns that we can observe in encounter groups. I will here present them in a roughly sequential order that is, however, not strict. So first pattern is milling around. It's basically, in the first stages of the group where the group is still trying to define its purpose and to become more cohesive. The second one is resistance to personal expression or exploration. Whether we like it or not, usually in the first stages of the group, the persons are not very ready or willing to present themselves very authentically. Because of that, when it comes to feelings, usually group members start by talking about past feelings, and then moving more towards the here and now, they move on to expressing mostly negative feelings. It is after this stage that we can usually start observing the expression and exploration of material that is personally meaningful among the members. And this also leads to feelings, immediate interpersonal feelings to be expressed in the group gradually. When this happens, then we can start talking about a healing capacity that is developing within the group. After that follows the beginning of change, which usually starts with self-acceptance among the members. This leads also to the gradual cracking of facades and the more authentic expression of members, which then is usually followed by the members receiving feedback about this expression. And sometimes it can also lead to confrontation. However, this authenticity also can lead to helping relationships being developed not only inside the group, but also outside the group sessions. And this is where, according to the person-centered theory, we can start talking about the basic encounter, which means, as we defined before, the meeting of persons in a very authentic way. It is then that usually positive feelings and feelings of closeness can be expressed. And lastly, we can also observe behavior changes within the group that hopefully later can lead also to behavioral changes outside.
So whenever we're going through these theories about groups, we need to remember that there is a bit of a difference between a group therapy situation and a role-playing group per se, in the way that the space is held. Now there, as we know, can be overlap, meaning that you have a therapist who's running a therapeutic group, tabletop group, for example. However, I think this is very interesting to understand in terms of groups in general and in terms of the types of dynamics we see in role-playing communities. And it's especially interesting when we're talking about transformative role-playing games, because if you are holding a group role-playing session, one of the interesting things is that this can happen very, very fast. A lot of these stages can happen really, really fast. So you might end up at the cracking of facades like way sooner than you would in a normal interaction because of the alibi of play, which is one of the things that makes play so powerful.
So the last theory we are going to mention here when it comes to groups is Yalom's theory about the therapeutic forces in groups. According to him, there are 11 therapeutic forces that exist in groups. Again, like Sarah said, although this theory mostly derives from the psychotherapeutic practice, it can be observed also in groups outside of this context. So the first one has to do with instillation of hope, more specifically an encouragement that in a psychotherapeutic context that recovery is possible by sharing stories and information. Universality, so a recognition of the shared experiences within the group, and the knowing that our personal problems are actually not unique. The third one is imparting of information, so teaching each other about problems, issues, and also learning factual information about treatment options in the case of psychotherapy, but it can be anything else if we're talking about other groups. Altruism, so helping and supporting others. This can actually also build self-esteem, by experiencing the ability to help other people. And it can also help to develop adaptive coping mechanisms. The fifth one is simulation of the primary family. So within the groups, we can actually sometimes identify and change the dysfunctional patterns or roles that we played in our primary family. Then number 6 is the development of social skills. I think this one is, quite apparent. In groups, we can learn new ways to talk about feelings, observations, concerns, etc. Imitative behavior. So within the group, we can model another person's manners and recovering skills, but we can also become that model for other people. Interpersonal learning, this can come through modeling, vicarious learning, but also finding out things about ourselves and about other people through the group. Yalom specifically describes 3 important concepts when it comes to interpersonal learning. The first one is the importance of interpersonal relationships. The second one is the possibility of a corrective emotional experience. And the third one is the notion that the group is a social microcosm. The 9th one is group cohesiveness, so the feeling of belonging in the group and of valuing it. 10th, catharsis, so the release of emotional tension and expressing, of course, these emotions in a safe environment. And the last one has to do with existential factors, like, for example, risk and responsibility. So learning to take responsibility for our own actions can be an example of this.
So a lot of therapists who are familiar with Yalom's work share that Yalom's group processes they match very closely to what happens in role-playing groups, and therefore role-playing groups, particularly things like tabletop, but also LARP, can be used in a therapeutic context to, for example, do this development of social skills, to do this imitative or modeling behavior, and to learn new ways of being with each other, to reparent. There's all sorts of ways in which the group can serve as a model for different kinds of behavior and as a testing ground, a safe testing ground to try out different types of behavior. And it is even more powerful in a way because of the alibi and the character, because you actually have this extra layer of protection here. So the safe space that Elektra was talking about, or a space that at least feels safe, feels even safer because it's not really you, it's the character, and it's not really reality, it's the fiction. Although that material can then be used to process outside of the game, whether therapeutically or in a debrief or whatever. So I think although these are therapeutic in nature, the way they're being discussed, I think you'll find a lot of people spontaneously talking about their experiences within leisure games in these terms, and within leisure communities.
According to Yalom and his theory, there are 4 main functions of the group facilitator. The first one is the emotional stimulation of the group. So challenging, confronting, suggesting activities, modeling, like we already described, taking personal risks also, and self-disclosure. The second one is caring for the group. So offering one's support, positive regard, and also safety, warmth, acceptance, genuineness, and concern. The third one is meaning attribution. So to foster explanations and clarifications of meaning, also to facilitate self-interpretations within the group, and generally providing a framework for change by helping to translate feelings and experiences into ideas. The last one is executive function, also very important. So setting boundaries, rules, reaching collectively agreed goals, managing time, and suggesting procedures. Moving from theory into practice, how do we facilitate an encounter group? So here are some do's and don'ts. The do's, first of all, climate setting. To set a climate with purpose, trust, and safety within the group. So acceptance of group, but also acceptance of each and every individual within the group, empathic understanding, operating authentically, facilitating meaningful confrontation and feedback within the group members, ensuring safety and consent, especially when it comes to physical contact within the group. And lastly, trusting in the group potential and also trying to transmit this trust to the group members. Now, the don'ts. Strict planning and gimmicks are usually not very helpful in facilitating groups. Neither are specific expectations of the group's goals and achievements. Making assumptions and interpretations about group members, also not very helpful. And generally, for sure, not helpful to have an attitude of authority or expert within the group. So the leadership, let's say, should not be based in directivity, and power play is something that can not only not be helpful, but also be destructive for groups.
That's a great segue into what we're going to talk about next, which is social conflict in role-playing game communities. And part of that does tie in specifically to facilitation and how the group is held. I've spent a lot of my career talking about the positive benefits of role-playing games. And in order to balance that out, I thought it would be important to talk about some of the conflicts that arise that can be quite painful and difficult for groups to navigate. And so I did a study on this, and the themes that I came up with based on the data, the ethnographic data from others, are schisms. That's the first concept, and that's when a group splits in part. We talked earlier about the storming stage when there's a lot of boundary testing, and sometimes the leadership gets tested during that as well. Sometimes what can happen is the group can fracture if the leadership is not able to handle that schism in a way that makes the group feel safe for whatever reason. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean a failing of leadership, but it does mean that the group dissolves, and probably not in that neat way that we were talking about with adjourning, where there's this processing, this positive processing that's going on. So schisms can be quite painful for communities. They can especially be painful when people feel forced to make a choice between different leaders, but they are actually quite normal. They happen in human groups. Schisms are just sort of part of the human experience. So learning how to navigate them is quite important. Something specific to role-playing games, internet communication. So if you're doing a lot of role-playing online, or if you're having debates about role-playing theory online, a lot can be lost in translation through the internet. Although I will say that role-playing games thrive on the internet, especially right now. So there's also a lot of really positive interactions that can happen, but just keeping in mind that that face-to-face contact can actually clear up a lot of miscommunication. Here I talk about intimate relationships. By that, what I mean are either romantic or sexual interactions between players, although intimacy can take many forms. It can also be like a very deep closeness of friendship. But if that closeness for some reason ruptures, it can cause this fragmentation that we've been talking about, or tensions within the group. There's this concept called creative agendas that comes from the Forge and before that. I won't get into too much detail about this because it's a very complex theory, but basically when people have different expectations of what a gaming group should be like, for example, if it's some people really want to focus on the story, narrativism. Some people want to focus on the tactics and the rules, that's gamism. people want to simulate a realistic environment, that's simulationism, or if people want to immerse deeply into the characters and that's their focus, that's called immersionism, depending on who you ask. These terms can vary from community to community. And in fact, there's conflict around these terms, even discussing these terms and what they mean. But the point of the study was to show how different creative agendas can cause conflicts within groups. And then I also talk about the facilitator and player power conflicts. And this goes back to what Elektra was just talking about. If the facilitator is making a power play over the group, which is kind of in a lot of traditional role-playing games, the facilitator's role is to challenge the group and to exert power so that they have something to push against. But if they're doing that in a way that other people feel railroaded or oppressed in some way, that can be really problematic. And going the other direction too, if the players are trying to do too much rules lawyering or trying to work the system or in some way challenging the authority of the group in a way that feels disruptive to other people, that can cause conflicts. Next slide, please. And then I talk extensively, many examples of bleed in and bleed out that came from the research. So just as a recap, bleed in is when contents spill over from one's daily life into the game and into the character, and bleed out is the opposite, vice versa effect, where things from the game spill out into daily life. And we can think about, for example, intimate relationships as an area that has been talked of a lot in terms of bleed. So for example, if someone happens to be attracted to someone, they may gravitate towards that person in character in ways that maybe doesn't even make sense for the storyline. Or if they happen to be in a relationship with somebody, maybe they're also a relationship in the game. That could be examples of bleed. And these things aren't inherently problematic. They're just they can cause conflict at certain times. And then bleed out, if people develop romantic feelings for each other, but that's not really compatible with their relationship status, for example, or if people have a really intense antipathy, meaning that they have some sort of competition or conflict within the game that is particularly emotionally charged, that can cause conflicts outside of the game, not just between the two members, but between the community as a whole. So when thinking about bleed, it's really important to learn strategies to manage it. And we're going to talk about the difference between resolving and managing and transforming later. But just some basic strategies are debriefing, which we talk about a lot, so creating this space for this processing that Elektra is talking about. A lot of these things we have embedded in role-playing communities, but making space to actually process and make meaningful conclusions about what was experienced in the game is part of what debriefing is there for. Also to get sort of any negative feelings, be able to talk them out and be heard by the group. Communication off game. So if a group just meets up and plays and doesn't actually get to know each other off game, they don't de-roll together, they don't process together, people can mistake what happened in game for the person's true personality, for example, or the way they feel about them. Cooperative play instead of competitive play. So even if you're playing a game that has a competition dynamic, having a sort of collective and cooperative atmosphere within the group helps a lot. Having breaks between play, so not playing continuously, but actually having time to decompress, sometimes to debrief. Having off-game socializing activities, so having group activities that don't have to do with the game. Some groups will, for example, spend the weekend doing things for charity, and that's a way to bond with the group. Or they will have often after parties or after dinners. These are very common socializing activities. We mentioned de-rolling, but this is very important to really emphasize that you are different. The role that you're playing in daily life is very different than the role that you're playing in the game, even if there are similarities, just to make that ritualized. And sometimes introducing yourself as yourself rather than as the character can help bridge that gap. Some situations may escalate and require third-party mediation, and that mediation of course, ideally would be paid mediators who know what they're doing, but oftentimes it ends up being volunteer organizers or other co-players that end up mediating disputes. Ideally, people can talk to each other and learn to resolve disputes between themselves, but sometimes it does take community intervention. However, it is important to realize that when people escalate to the point where it requires community intervention, that can often cause schisms. So taking a certain amount of personal responsibility for your own interpersonal dynamics within the group is quite important. Next slide, please. All right, so a little bit about what I mentioned before. So we're talking about conflict. There are lots of different approaches to handling conflict, and you'll see it talked about different ways in the literature. So there's conflict resolution, which a lot of people use that term. And to resolve something means to solve it or to end it. So it's an idea that if we just, for example, in the example I mentioned earlier, if we talk things out of game, then it'll resolve the problem because you'll see that I'm not my character. And I didn't do those things, my character did. So that might be a way to resolve a misunderstanding, for example. Conflict management, so that's like to tamp down or to suppress the conflict. So bleed management, for example, is a term that we often use. So if people have like really, really intense bleed and they're having trouble emotionally regulating, learning conflict management skills and emotional regulation skills can help to lessen the emotional impact on the group and on that person of that bleed. However, if people are told to suppress their bleed and their feelings are not being acknowledged by the group, that can actually have some really negative impacts to both their mental health, but also to the atmosphere of the group if other people don't feel like that they can share how they're feeling. So there's a negotiation here between conflict management and one's personal needs. And then there's conflict transformation, and which we're going to talk a little bit at length about. And that's the idea of using conflict as a positive opportunity, seeing it as a positive opportunity to enact certain processes of change. And Elektra started this talk with this discussion of a process of change. So it's not just like one instance, it's actually something that takes time, and it actually takes a group process often in order to fully achieve. And since we're talking about a group activity and we're focused on transformation, this is quite interesting, this idea of conflict transformation. However, it takes time, as we will see. And sometimes we don't have time. Maybe you have 5 minutes before you get to your next game and you want to resolve something with another co-player, or you want to apologize for what your character did. That's totally reasonable. But these are just some different approaches, and each has its own merits and its appropriate times. Next slide, please. So a little bit about conflict transformation in role-playing games. Jean-Paul Lederach, who is one of the leading figures in conflict transformation, he sees change not as one event, but as a series of change processes that require many strategies to address the complexity of the conflict. So you might have a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy happening at the same time. So these strategies are envisioned as a spiral that contain what he calls a web of dynamic circles that create momentum and direction. So this approach allows us to embrace this need for linearity that we have. We want to feel like we're moving forward, but also it creates these feedback loops and acknowledges that sometimes we need to go back to the drawing board and integrate new feedback. We talked about feedback earlier in terms of group processes. And we need to iterate sometimes as a group. And this is very relevant to game design because we iterate as we try new things. And those kinds of processes aren't necessarily associated with linearity. They're often associated with this circularity. So it encourages us to integrate both these short-term and long-term strategies, and also to employ yes and thinking. They talk specifically about that in conflict transformation, which of course we also do in improv and role-playing. So there is a improvisational element to conflict transformation that is really interesting, and a co-creative element. This becomes very relevant, like I said, to game design, to playfulness, to learning, and all sorts of other human processes. Next slide, please. So Lederach, again, views conflict as situations that are opportunities to collaboratively envision positive futures. So it's not just a way to address a conflict between two people, but actually to use this conflict as a jumping off point to say, how can we build a better world in general? Or how can we build a better community? Or how can we help people who are facing these kinds of conflicts on a long-term basis? So it's taking a situation that might feel dysfunctional at the time or destructive and trying to figure out ways to make it constructive. And similarly to what we talked about before, there's this idea that change is a circle. Things will move forward. Sometimes they will hit a wall and movement will stop. Sometimes they will move backwards. Sometimes they will collapse and then they'll move forward again. And oftentimes when we're in these experiences of hitting a wall, of collapse, we can quit, right? Or we can escalate. And the idea here is to notice when that happens, that resistance, and we'll talk about resistance in a bit, and to remember that things can move forward if we are willing to be in the discomfort of this process of transformation. Next slide, please. It's important to note that when we're talking about growth here, and we're talking about change processes, my process may look very different than Elektra's. That's just kind of the nature of growth. It's highly individual. It happens at different speeds, rates, frequencies, and intensities, depending on the situation and the person. It's often messy in the moment. So we talk about these group processes and how wonderful the outcomes are, but in the moment, it can feel very messy. It can feel, people can feel very embroiled in their internal or external conflicts, and these things must be addressed. And we symbolize that by the caterpillar's transformation into a butterfly, which is not a beautiful process to behold as it's happening, but has a beautiful outcome. However, this messiness can be embraced by the person experiencing it. And this is called having a growth mindset. Now, when we say having a growth mindset, we're not trying to say that people should accept certain kinds of behavior or certain kinds of oppression and have a growth mindset around them necessarily, because that's not a very kind way of thinking about conflict, and especially when we're talking about structural oppression. However, having a growth mindset has all sorts of therapeutic benefits in terms of learning how to reframe one story of one's life and learning how to persist even when things are difficult. So you might have this feeling of resistance that comes up whenever there's some big change happening, and that's totally natural. Again, thinking back about the circle and how sometimes that resistance may stop you, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. Next slide, please. So another model of change that I find really interesting is from a therapeutic practice called motivational interviewing. And it envisions, again, processes of an individual change that are similar to Lederach's circular model. So notably, motivational interviewing has been used in recovery, particularly recovery around addiction. But these concepts aren't necessarily just restricted to issues of addiction. So I just wanted to make that clear. Growth often involves us, having these fits and starts as we're kind of evolving into this new part of ourselves. And so when we have that relapse back, that doesn't necessarily mean, again, that that collapse, that everything has fallen apart and it will never get better. That actually is kind of part of the process. And so what I find very interesting about motivational interviewing is it just acknowledges that people are at certain stages. So they may be at the pre-contemplative stage, meaning they may have absolutely no desire to change whatsoever. But then maybe they're contemplating it at the next stage. Maybe they're preparing for it. Maybe they're actually taking action in the next stage. Maybe they're maintaining that action, and then all of a sudden they relapse. It can feel completely out of the blue. And then that brings us back to this pre-contemplation phase. So, the point is that change is difficult, and it has different cycles attached to it. So in this idea of relapse, resistance, these are just central components of the change process and shouldn't be seen as a failure. Next slide, please. And so, again, it's part of the process to experience resistance. There are some examples here. One is loss. So people feel resistant to letting go of someone or something important to them. And that can include even our own feeling of control, which is kind of necessary when you're talking about role-playing games. There's a certain surrender into the experience to allow yourself to actually play. And that can be difficult. Especially when you're working with groups that are not there voluntarily, like, some people are forced to go to therapy, for example, or are in a classroom where they don't have a choice whether or not to participate in a role-playing activity. So, that loss of control can feel really scary. And that also leads to things like intimacy, resistance to opening up to others, potentially getting hurt, vulnerability, resistance to lowering those defense mechanisms that have kept us safe in the past. So just because there's resistance doesn't mean that resistance isn't there for a reason. Sometimes it's a very necessary survival mechanism, but oftentimes it can also get in the way of our growth. So identity, resistance to any process that might invite us to question our sense of self. We're role-playing, so we're literally questioning our sense of self by the nature of the activity. So that can cause resistance. That can be scary. And then resistance to things that might shift our paradigm. So things that might question our worldview, especially when we're designing games to, for example, step into the shoes of another person, which we never can fully do, but we can maybe live, a life, a character's life, and try to understand the perspective of another person, build empathy for that person or that group. That might be really scary to someone's worldview if it's very different than their own. And then the status quo, we oftentimes just resist any process that might destabilize our perceptions, or might disrupt our desire to keep living our lives the way that we currently are, even if it might actually be the best thing for us to actually challenge that status quo. But it's also important to note that sometimes the status quo is perfectly fine. We're not here advocating that people should be changing everything about their lives all the time. This is more for when people feel stuck or they feel like they'd like to move on to another phase of their evolution. These are the kinds of things that can get in the way. Next slide, please. And Elektra is going to talk to us about feedback.
Okay, throughout the presentation today, we have been talking about feedback and self-exposure, and the importance that both of them have in group processes. So let's see more specifically, what does this entail and how it can be done productively and effectively. So there is feedback on content and there is feedback on process. When we are talking about feedback on content, we are talking about words, arguments, meaning, whereas when we are talking about feedback on process, we are giving feedback on the nature of the relationships and interactions in the here and now. There are two main facilitator functions when it comes to feedback. The first one is to facilitate the self-reflective loop of each group member. And the second one is to provide a commentary on the process of the group as a whole. Here it is interesting to add the concept of the Johari window. The Johari window is a framework for understanding the conscious and unconscious bias that can help increase self-awareness, but also our understanding of others, especially in group settings. The name comes from the two people that coined the term, so Joseph Luft and Harrington Ingham. As you can see in the first figure, the Johari window has 4 spots or 4 areas. The first one is the open area or the open arena. Here we have the things that are known to the self, known to the group member, but also known to others. The second one, the blind spot, contains the things that are known to others, but not known to the self. The third one, which we call the hidden area or facade, are things that are known to self, but not known to others. And the fourth one, the unknown, contains things that are not known either to self nor to others. In figure number 2, we see how the Johari window can gradually change through the feedback process. So gradually, through asking for feedback, but also disclosing or giving feedback, the open area, the open arena will start developing, will start expanding, and the other areas will gradually decrease.
And I just want to note before we move on to this, we're talking about feedback here within this context, this wider context of creating this group safety and this containment that we've been talking about. So it's not just giving people unsolicited feedback that necessarily will help. It's within a certain context.
Thank you, Sarah. So within this context, and to make it more relevant to role-playing, let's see some examples, okay, not from the open area, which can be quite straightforward, but of the other 3. So some examples of the facade or the hidden area can be elements of queerness, a diagnosis, or some trauma that are known to the player, but are not known to others. The blind spot, on the other hand, can be some behaviors of the player, like antisocial behaviors, but also positive things like leadership skills of the player that are visible to others, known to others, but that the player themselves cannot fully grasp. And then lastly, the unknown area. Here we're talking about mainly subconscious elements, either personal or group subconscious elements that come into play and that are known neither to the person or to the others. Lastly, when we are talking about this in the role-playing context, we should distinguish between feedback on the character and feedback on the player, taking also the alibi into consideration and making sure that we are as clear as possible when giving feedback about which of the 2 we are talking about.
And also related to that, a therapeutic trick that some of the tabletop therapists will use is when they're pointing out maybe these antisocial behaviors, they'll use the character's name rather than the player's name. So they'll say, oh, it was really strange when, your character behaved in this way, and then they'll get feedback from the group about how it felt when the character did that. But if they did something, say, very brave, like they set a boundary or they confronted, an enemy, they might say, wow, it was so great when you, as a player, were able to do that thing, because then that can break down the alibi enough for them to see, maybe I can transfer these skills into my daily life.
So regardless of the type of feedback, feedback is always an opportunity for growth. When we are being more specific, we can distinguish between 5 types of feedback, according to Carl Rogers. First, we have the evaluative feedback. This has to do with the evaluation of the content or the process that we are talking about. And here it is important to try to evaluate the action instead of the actor and be descriptive instead of being vague. Interpretive feedback has to do with essentially requesting confirmation or clarification of a message of something that we think we understood. So often it comes in the form of a question. We can also use paraphrasing or restating. And what we are restating is actually the main point as a way of communicating attention. Supportive feedback has to do with communicating encouragement in response to a message, while probing feedback has to do with communicating targeted requests for specific information. This can be an opportunity to interact, to clarify, but also to promote our positions within a discussion. Lastly, we have understanding feedback. This has to do with communicating empathy and also sympathy for the group member, the source of the message. And it also has to do with responding to the innate desire of every human to be heard and understood. Let's give some examples to be more precise. So when it comes to evaluative feedback, like we said before, instead of saying, for example, you are not a nice person, we could instead say that making rude remarks about others is not a nice thing to do. An example of interpretive feedback can be, so you are interested in joining the guild, is this right? An example of supportive feedback, the song was awesome and your singing skills are improving day by day. Probing feedback example, could you tell me more about what happened? And an example of understanding feedback, it sounds like you have personal experience of this. Would you like to talk about it? Now, another tool we can use when it comes to giving feedback, but also self-exposure, is the I message. So iMessage is an effective communication tool that we can use not only to express ourselves and to give feedback, but also to prevent escalation of conflict. What we are essentially expressing through the iMessage is ourselves and our lived experience. It's a concept that comes from the Gordon model of communication skills coined by Thomas Gordon. And it involves a threefold message. The first element is behavior, the second is consequences, and the third is feelings. Now, to explain this a bit more, when we're talking about behavior, we are talking about an accurate and neutral description of the behavior that we want to talk about and we want to give feedback about. When we're talking about experiences, we're talking about practical, real, and tangible consequences that this behavior has on us. And when we're talking about feelings, we're talking about the feelings that derive from these consequences. Let us see some more concrete types and examples of iMessages. So first of all, we have the declarative iMessage that we can use to declare something, as the name says. One example can be, I enjoy cooperative games. Having the opportunity to work with others as a team is meaningful and makes me feel fulfilled. A second type is the positive or appreciative message that we can use to give positive feedback to others. An example could be, thank you for notifying me in advance about your absence. It gave me time to adjust my plans accordingly and I feel grateful. The preventive iMessage can be, specifically used, as we said before, to prevent escalation of conflict. So an example of this can be, next week I will be very busy, so in case you cannot make it, I would be very grateful if you could notify me in advance so I can adjust my schedule. And lastly, the confronting I message that can be used in order to talk about behaviors that we find unhelpful for us in a way that is not aggressive. An example can be, when you talk simultaneously, I have a hard time concentrating, and that really frustrates me.
And just to sort of piggyback on that last one, oftentimes when we think of the word confronting, when we think of the word confrontation, we think of an escalation of conflict. We think of something bad that's happening. But a confrontation is really just actually acknowledging that something has happened and processing it. And there's ways, like Elektra's saying, to use I statements that to be confrontational without escalating, hopefully. Now, of course, we can't control how other people respond to the feedback that we're giving them. But there are ways that we can phrase things that can lower the possibility of them getting defensive or aggressive as a result. Some people may regardless, but often if we share our own experience, our own feelings, our own needs, and the impact that people's behavior has on us in a way that's non-judgmental, we might have a better outcome. So one of the things to do when somebody is giving feedback or when somebody is sharing their story is to engage in active listening. Active listening can be interactive. An example of this in role-playing groups are semi-structured debriefs, or they can involve some processing can involve no crosstalk, so taking turns, and this is more like the structured debrief. So for example, if you get everybody into a group after a game and you ask each of them the same question and everybody has the same amount of time and nobody's interrupting each other to have an ongoing conversation, that would be a structured debrief. Either way, there are ways, particularly with this first one, particularly when you have this semi-structured debrief where there is a little bit of dialogue that can happen, where people can engage in active listening processes. So this schematic talks a little bit about some of those processes. So the first step is to just be attentive to actually, I know it sounds, maybe obvious, but just to really hold space for that person and to be attentive to what they're sharing. For example, if we're on our phones or if we're doing something else, which I have a tendency to do, it can send a signal that we're not actually paying attention, even if we are trying to do that. The second part is asking open-ended questions. So asking questions about what they're sharing that invites further elaboration, that makes them feel more comfortable sharing, that indicates that you are interested in what their experience. And there's also these probing questions. We talked about probing a little bit in the last slide. So, trying to get a little bit more information about a very specific thing. Now, probing needs to be done very delicately, because sometimes if people are in a state of resistance or they're defending something, maybe they don't feel comfortable sharing that. So that's something to be aware of. But sometimes it can feel actually really liberating when someone asks a probing question about something that it's really important to them, but might be difficult to share. Requesting clarification. So this is often called sometimes perception checking. So we all live in our own little subjective universe, meaning that I interpret Elektra's behaviors in a Sarah way and vice versa. That's just the way that our minds work. We unfortunately cannot mind meld, at least not in the way that we can see in Star Trek. So we have to sometimes ask for clarification. If somebody makes a statement, it's like, okay, when you said this, it could have been for this reason, or I might have heard this thing. Can you clarify to me what you mean by that? And this is not a way to antagonize someone. It's a way to actually make sure that we're on the same page and interpreting the same material in the same way. So clarification can be really helpful. It also helps people feel heard if you're asking a clarifying question, because that means that you actually were paying attention to what they were saying. Similarly, paraphrasing. This is something that I really struggle with, but it's really, really important to say, okay, what I heard you say just now is da 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 da. And then you're communicating to the person not only that you were listening, but also that you are able to convey their ideas. And if they, again, this is a point where they can clarify. Like if your summarizing is, or your paraphrasing is not accurate, they can say, well, it wasn't quite that, it's actually this thing. I've been doing this a lot with my research, and it's really helpful. Instead of me taking a quote that someone said and just interpreting it, actually going back to the original respondent and saying, hey, does this sound accurate? Does my interpretation sound accurate? And then they can tweak the language so that they can be better understood. This takes time, right? This can be a time-consuming process, but it is very helpful for relationships. And then just being attuned to and reflecting feelings. So, this isn't about being in problem-solving mode and saying, okay, you're having an issue, let's fix it, which some of us might jump to that place, especially if we really love helping people, we think we've got all the answers, or if maybe it just makes us feel really uncomfortable if somebody's sharing something really vulnerably. Being attuned to that person and to their feelings and reflecting those back can actually help a person feel supported. And that might be all that they actually need in that moment. They might not need you to fix their problems. Again, something that I struggle with, but just being able to say, wow, that seems really difficult for you, or from what I'm hearing, that's a painful experience. Just having that reflected back can actually be really powerful, because a lot of people have had the opposite experience in life, where somebody has said, oh, well, that's not a big deal, or tough it up, or, boys don't cry, or whatever it is. So the opposite of reflecting one's feelings and attuning to them. So again, summarizing everything that was said at the end, but then look, it's a circle. So going back to being attentive. So it's not like we just, okay, done. Listening, done forever. We're on to the next thing. Okay. Next slide. So there are ways to sort of ask for more reflective responses. So maybe somebody's sort of at the beginning of telling you something, and then you can ask certain questions. We talked about those probing questions that can help them reflect more and help you also reflect that you are listening. So first and foremost, saying thank you for sharing is almost always a good idea. If somebody's sharing something very vulnerable, pausing and remembering to say thank you for sharing that, because that can be very difficult. And then asking something like, do you mind telling me more about blank? Or what is it about this thing that you shared that's important to you? Or how did this thing affect you? So if we think about this in the context of a debrief during like say you're having a semi-structured debrief after a game, and somebody is sharing this really powerful bleed experience that they had that maybe might be difficult for you to relate to. Thanking them for sharing that, because it's probably pretty vulnerable. They're probably emotionally raw from it. Maybe asking these clarifying questions. Do you mind telling me more about that particular thing and why that was so powerful for you? Or why was it so important to you that you stood up to that bully in that LARP? Maybe there's more behind this bleed that needs to be processed. Or, how did it affect you when your in-game lover betrayed you? How did that feel for you as a player? These are just some examples of ways you could engage in this process, even just as a co-player, not necessarily even as a facilitator.
So the last thing that we wanted to talk about today is group creativity. it's needless to say that creativity is something that is enhanced in multiple ways from participating in role play activities. But it is also very important to see how we can, in a group setting, move from individual creativity to group creativity. So moving from individual traits to collective competences and team level challenges. It is important to think of creativity in its three dimensions. The first one is innovation, the second one is creative thinking, and the third one is creative problem solving. And in role-playing games, all three dimensions are equally visible and important. Now, the role-playing itself, of course, enhances creativity, as we said, but there are also some more specific group creativity techniques that we wanted to share with you because maybe they can be helpful in some contexts of role-playing groups, but also debrief activities. So the first one is brainstorming. Brainstorming, I think, is quite known. It's a technique that helps the group generate as many ideas as possible without any criticism in the process. Another type of brainstorming that can be equally interesting and useful is question brainstorming. So in this technique, instead of trying to generate ideas or solutions, we are trying to generate questions that will lead into reflection in the group. We also have the nominal group technique. It's a technique that can be used in order to collectively evaluate ideas. This can often be used in combination with brainstorming in order, after the brainstorming occurs, to evaluate the ideas the group came up with. Then there is also what we call team mind mapping. You may be familiar with the concept of mind maps, which usually is a very individual activity. So in team mind mapping, what we do is try to consolidate individual ideas, individual mind maps into a single map for the whole group. Another interesting technique is the affinity diagram or the affinity technique. This can be used in order to group ideas that have come up. And a practical way to do this is with Post-its. So we use Post-its, we write each idea on a Post-it, and then we move the Post-its around in order to group them into possible categories. Lastly, we have the group passing technique. This can be a technique very often seen also in game jams. So what is it? It's the enhancing of an individual idea by each group member taking a piece of paper, writing, an initial idea, and then passing this paper to the person on the right, and trying to develop further the idea that is on the piece of paper that they now have in their hands. Instead of just using, piece of paper, we can sometimes use a whole notebook, and in this case, we are talking about idea books. We hope that you will have the opportunity to try out some of these techniques and maybe come back to us with feedback about how this helped you.
And just to sort of sum up, talking about group creativity, as we mentioned, role-playing is by nature a co-creative activity, but sometimes we're not that skilled at co-creativity. This is a skill that we have to practice. And so we can have really structured activities like we're talking about here. But the overall goal is to honor each person's contribution, right? And that can be difficult to do, particularly if you have certain strong personalities within the group that might dominate the conversation, or if you have, a lot of ideas floating around and then one gets selected to kind of move forward. So these kinds of strategies can help in the game design process. They can actually be run in game. Like if you have the dreaded meeting LARP, where a bunch of people are getting together for a very long meeting, you could probably use these techniques to make it more interesting. So it's not just talking heads and everybody else has to listen. And or to plan strategy for a battle or whatever it is, the theme of the game. I've seen certain co-creative activities work really well when sort of making up magic spells and rituals on the fly, for example. But then also, again, kind of talking about debriefing. So how do we process this experience afterwards? That can also be a group process if it's held in a certain way. But really, I think this issue of group creativity is so important to the whole project, really, of transformative role-playing games, because it is in that collaborative, co-creative, spontaneous space that role-playing really thrives and really makes it unique compared to other art forms. And I honestly do believe it really can help us change ourselves, change the world in positive ways. So we hope that you've enjoyed this video. We do have some references to show you from all of the videos in this series, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.